Welcome to part one of the lecture for chapter 3 and 4 for CSP 550. This is going to be a two-part lecture because chapter 3 is relatively lengthy, and so I'm keeping it onto one PowerPoint, but the lecture part will have to be split. When we look at chapter 3, what we're looking at is pretty much the meat of the course. The key concepts have to do with individualized assessment, authentic assessment, critical skills for teaching, and writing the IEP. So it's all about assessment. Where we start is with the key concept in individualized assessment that occurs in the general education classroom environment is recommended to identify skills and determine needs. What we have to do is strike a balance between individualized instruction and maximum access to the general education curriculum. So what that means is that, as we've been seeing, kids with significant cognitive disabilities are very different from one another. Some are verbal, some are nonverbal. Some have a consistent communication system, some don't. Some are ambulatory, some are not ambulatory. And so you have to have individualized instruction because of the combination of needs that a child has. But on the other hand, the state requires that every child be assessed on the general ed curriculum, age-appropriate general ed curriculum. And so what that means is that if I'm in fourth grade, it doesn't matter whether I'm nonverbal or non-ambulatory. You still have to test me on the equivalent of the fourth grade curriculum. So individualized assessment has to hit the child's individual needs, but it also has to connect to the general ed curriculum, and it has to be sensitive to family issues, but be grounded in the content and skills required to meet state curriculum standards. So this MAAECF that we've been wrestling with is an attempt to make that happen. So we start with the idea of standardized assessment. Anytime we talk about standardized assessment, we're talking about assessment that is performed with the same set of procedures and the same content for everyone who takes that assessment. So here are some problems with it. The first one is a false assumption that children acquire skills in hierarchical order. So if we look at a developmental checklist, for example, a developmental checklist says that an infant, if you're looking at motor skills, an infant, the first big motor skill we get is them holding their head up, and then they sit up, and then they roll over, and then they crawl, and then they creep. And crawling is where your two arms pull you forward and your legs are kind of dead weight. And creeping is what most people think of as crawling, and that's that cross patterning where the left arm goes forward at the same time that the right leg goes forward, and then you switch those. Well, for kids with cerebral palsy, just as an example, or some kids with various types of brain anomalies, they actually may skip crawling and go straight to creeping. They may walk before they crawl. And so the assumption that everybody acquires skills in the same order is not correct. There are kids who have very low, for instance, gross motor skills who have very strong fine motor skills. I have a cousin whose son has autism, and he didn't walk until he was about 16 months old, but before he could walk, he could take clocks apart. So he had fine motor skills. He could work child-proof locks before he could walk. So sometimes the skills are not in the same order. Second problem with standardized assessment is they don't necessarily consider culture, region, race, or ethnicity. An example of this would be there was a professor here who worked with standardizing an IQ test, and they gave him test questions to test. And one of the questions had to do with what do you grow on a farm. And the kids in the Delta were giving answers like cotton, catfish, soybeans, rice. None of those were acceptable answers. The answers they were looking for were beans, peas, tomatoes. And so that was a regional difference. Biased in favor of those with strong language skills, fine motor skills, vision, and hearing. So when we give somebody a standardized test, they have to see small print, they have to be able to express themselves, they have to be able to point to things, they have to hear the question. And so if you're missing any of those skills, then it can bias your responses. So we start with the idea of authentic assessment. Authentic assessment includes a student-family interview, review of past records, ecological inventories with observational recordings and portfolios recommended over standard forms of assessment. So what we call this is person-centered assessment. The assessment is not centered on the content, it's centered on the person. So let me give you a few examples of what we're talking about. The first thing we talk about here is caregiver and teacher interviews. What we're looking for is the child's strengths and weaknesses. We're looking for their preferences and their priorities. So let me show you one. So what we can do is we can sit down with the parents with an interview form like this, and we can say, what's your child like at home? His temperament, his moods, how does he follow directions, memory, behavior? What are your child's strengths? What does he like to do? What does he not like to do? What are his personality traits? What was it like in your house when you were growing up? Any concerns about your child during their first few years? And so on. These questions are getting at the child's development, his likes, his interests, and his academic history. Another example that we can have of an interview is looking at a teacher interview. And so in the teacher interview, what we're asking are questions like, how long have you been working with it? What's it like to work with him? What are the biggest impediments to his success in school? Describe his special ed program. How would you describe his progress? What are his grades? What's your relationship with his parents? What are your major concerns about? And so all of these give us information about under what circumstance does this student learn best. Then we have observations in natural settings. What we want to do is we want to find out what the child's communication mode is, how does he have to be positioned to learn best, what is his functional hearing and vision. Now, we don't get this from a hearing test or a vision test. We get this from observing how he looks at things and what he listens to. What are his interactions with the environment? What are his interactions with people in the environment? And then academically, we want to know about his behaviors that are related to key academic skills and his interests and motivating experiences. And again, a lot of that can be pulled off of this care teacher interview and from the observation. So then we have some very specific person-centered assessment techniques. This Nietzsche Digest is excellent in talking about all the different assessments that are available. Your test this week from Chapter 3 will come primarily from this document. So if you want to study for your test, this is the place to go. Sorry about that, lost my place. Okay. Another thing that we can do to help understand how to teach this child is to use what's called a reinforcement assessment. And this reinforcement assessment, what it does is it asks questions about the things that the child likes to do, the things that they enjoy, the things that give them pleasure, and these can help us not only in how to reward the child for particular skills, but also how to engage him, how to get his interests. I already showed you the teacher interview form. No, this is a different one. Sorry about that. This is a different one. So on this teacher interview form, it talks about the child's work habits. It talks about his compliance. It talks about what his academic skills are. And it talks about what kinds of accommodations and modifications are being used for that child in the classroom. Some observation techniques that we can use. One is what's called an observation of student engagement. So in this, what you would do is you would do a video of the child, and then for every 15 seconds on that video, so you would watch it and you would look every 15 seconds and you would code, was he actively engaged or was he passively engaged? And then you would also put a code for if he was not engaged at all, out of seat, manipulating objects, touching another student, turning his body away, making audible sounds, talking at inappropriate times, inappropriate remark, or looking around the room. So for each 15 seconds, you would use one code, either AET, PET, OMO, or so on. What this allows us to do is see what the child's pattern of responsiveness is in the classroom. And then we have an assessment that I thought was very interesting. It's called mediated learning experience. And what it's measuring is certain aspects of the child's learning, his intentionality, whether he knows what's going on and is deliberately doing things, his meaning, transcendence, whether he can go from the task to his own experiences, sharing, whether the child is sharing with the teacher emotionally, and then sharing of experiences, competence, whether the task is being taught well, competence in praise and encouragement, and competence in whether we're teaching within the range where the child learns best, whether the teacher is focusing on the child rather than just on the product, whether the teacher is reading the student's cues well, and whether the teacher seems to be enjoying the student, and whether we're actually seeing change in behavior. And so what this does is this allows an outside observer to see how well the teacher is implementing each of these things, and then how well the child is responding to these things. This would be a really valuable tool if we've got a kid who doesn't seem to be responding to attention, to see what techniques are working and not working in getting that child's attention. Okay. Identifying critical skills involves observing general ed lessons, interpreting content standards for a grade level, and considering student and family goals and interests. So this is where we look at the clarifying standards that you're doing for your MAA-ECF projects. I won't go to that. Remember, we have to incorporate parents' concerns, and we have to synthesize general ed goals with the child's needs. Now, for the IEP, I am not going to take you through this, but there is a link to a PowerPoint on writing meaningful objectives. That's the other thing you need to do to study for your test this week. So your test this week will come from the PowerPoint on writing meaningful objectives and from the Nietzsche link. And I will make sure that on the quiz I have that these are the two things that your quiz this week is based on. That's part one.